The NBA recently came out with this really cool commercial for the kickoff of playoff season that centers around the concept of time. And one of the effects they used was this really funky motion trail blur thing that would follow players around or follow the ball as it was moving through the air or through a scene. And I'd never seen something like that before, but I wanted to try to recreate it. So today I'm going to teach you how to create this cool motion blur trail effect from the NBA playoffs commercial. And because I'm almost certain that they used some sort of plugin that I'm not aware of after actually trying to do this thing, we're going to do it and get like 90% of the way there without any plugins, using effects that are only native to After Effects. So without further ado, let's hop in. So we're here in After Effects, and this is the shot that we're going to be working with today. And I want to talk about what actually makes selecting a good shot when you're doing this, because there's some shots that you're going to want to use for this effect and some that you're not going to. I picked like a medium difficulty shot, but ideally when you're doing this effect, you want to pick a shot where your subject is moving in one direction. So you can see here, our subject is moving to the right, and that's pretty good. Here he takes a turn downhill and starts moving away from camera, which isn't great. But when your subject is moving in one direction, it's easier to make the motion trail that we're going to create look more realistic and set in the scene. Ideally, you don't want anybody crossing in front of your subject, because if you have that, then you just have to do more masking to make it look realistic. And then in an ideal world, you want contrast between your subject and the background, and you want a shallow depth of field, which means a blurry background where your subject stands out. And these two things are going to help with the Roto brush tool. So you can see here, I picked a shot where we have a really busy background and not a ton of depth of field because we're so far away from the action here. And our subject doesn't really contrast with the background. You can see there's a lot of blue happening in the background. He's wearing a blue jersey. It's not the worst shot ever, but it's not the best. But we're still going to get it done with this shot. But you know, when you're starting with this, and if you just want it to look good and you want it to be easy, try to pick a shot where the Roto brush is going to work well and think about those criteria. Now, before we keep going After Effects, I'm popping back into Premiere Pro to show you what I did to this clip to actually get it into After Effects. So when you're working with one of these clips, you want to make sure that you're bringing it from Premiere into After Effects at the frame rate that your composition is going to be in After Effects. I filmed this in 120 frames per second, but I want to edit on a 23.976 or 24 frame per second timeline. That way, when I'm using the Roto brush and cutting my subject out, I only have to cut out 24 frames for every second and not 120 frames. Because if you just drag this 120 frame per second clip onto a 24 frame per second timeline in After Effects, it's going to tell you that there's an error and the Roto brush isn't going to work as effectively as possible. So what I did is I dropped my clip onto a timeline like this, made sure that I had all the parts that I wanted there, and then I want to color grade it real quick. So we're actually going to use some of my LUTs, and let's just drop this one on. And we're going to make a couple quick adjustments just to get our white balance right. So let's bring that a little more orange, and I think we're a little overexposed, so we'll bring it down, maybe some contrast and some vibrance. And that's about that. And now here we want to click X with our clip selected so that it gets selected for export. Click Command M. And now we're going to export a QuickTime version of this. And we're going to make sure that we're exporting full resolution. Make sure you check use maximum render quality and render at maximum depth. And make sure that your sequence, when you export this, you just click export down here when you want to export it, is set to 23.976 frames per second, or if you want to work in like 30 frames per second or something, that's your prerogative, go ahead. But make sure that your sequence is set to the same frame rate that your composition in After Effects is going to be set into. Once you export that clip, then come back into After Effects, drop it on your timeline, and we can start working from here. The next thing we want to do is rotoscope our clip. So you're going to come up to here where you have the Roto brush tool. If you don't see this, all these tools up here, then go to Window, Workspaces, and click Effects. You may end up in the default workspace, which doesn't have those tools. So go to the Effects workspace, and then you'll have them all. But click on the Roto brush here, and then we're going to double click on our clip. And this brings us into this menu. We can scroll in a little bit. And we're going to hold Command and drag to make this a little bit bigger. And you're just going to do a selection of your subject. This can be fairly rough to start, but just really get it all like this. We're gonna get the ball as well. And you can see there's a lot of mistakes here. So we're going to hold Alt or Option, depending on if you're on Mac or PC, and deselect a bunch of areas that aren't supposed to be selected. At this point, you can see why it's important to have shallow depth of field and good contrast, because the shallower your depth of field and the more contrast between your subject and the background, the less manual tweaking you have to do with the roto brush. And then we're going to skip forward a frame, hold Command and click the right arrow. And then we can see what happens in the next frame, and we'll just keep going forward. And we're going to see what this looks like as the roto brush propagates, if it wants to do that. And there we go. So we can see how this is progressing. We're going to make adjustments along the way. So you can see here the ball fell out of our selection. So we're going to select that back in. But I've already rotoed this clip, so I'm not going to go too crazy with it. I'm just going to give you an idea of how this looks. And then we're going to fast forward through everything else. When you have a selection that you're happy with and you've gone through your entire clip, or at least the area where you want to add the blur, then you just need to click this freeze button and your roto brush selection will be locked into place. And that's going to give you something that looks like this. You can see here a defender's hand cut through him, so I've cut that out. We'll fix that type of stuff later. But now we have our subject removed from the background and we can properly blur him. But what you want to do first is export a PSD sequence or a PNG sequence of the work that we've already done. So what you want to do for that is go File, Export, Add to Render Queue, and then you're going to click right over here and we're going to select Photoshop Sequence. Change this to RGB plus alpha, meaning that we are maintaining transparency. Click OK. You're going to click right here and select the folder where you want to save this, and then click Render. When that is done, you'll be able to click Command I to import. You click on PSD sequence. You can click in on your PSD sequence, click on the first frame. Make sure you have Photoshop sequence checked and click open, and this is going to import your roto brush subject as a Photoshop sequence, and then you'll be able to work with it in a less intensive way on your system. Now we have our initial roto brush layer, which is this beige one right here, and we have our PSD comp that we've just imported, which is down here. These at this point are essentially the exact same thing. There's really no difference to them. But what we want to do at this point, as you can see what I've already done here, is, well, you can actually duplicate your initial composition and just disable a layer so that you have one copy that's clean with no effects of all that hard roto brush work that you've done, so you don't lose it. And then you want to add the pixel motion blur effect. So let's just do this again manually. So we're going to go to Effects and let's search up pixel motion blur and drag this right on. And we want to set the shutter angle really high so that you get essentially just a ton of samples that make it look like there's a big streak. And you can see how that looks. If we just turn this off and on, it kind of looks like motion blur. You want to set samples to make it so that this is actually smooth. This is going to take a while to preview. This is really intensive on your computer, this effect. But you can see here, this is now looking like a smooth blur effect. And don't copy exactly these numbers, just do what you need to do to make yours look good. But you can see the difference if I turn this off and turn this on. And now because this effect is so intensive, this is going to play back really, really slowly. So we're going to go through that exact same process again, where we just, maybe rename this Rotocomp plus blur. And we're going to go File, Export, Add to Render Queue. And once again, export this as a Photoshop sequence and choose RGB plus alpha. Export this to wherever you exported the last one. Just make sure it's named differently. Maybe go underscore blur after so you know that this is your subject cut out with blur. And then import it the same way. All right, so now we've prepared everything that we need to execute this effect. And at this point, I think the easiest way for me to show you how to do it is to just bring you into my finished composition and show you the steps that I did so that you can replicate them. So let's go through every single layer in this composition one by one. Starting from the bottom, we have the main shot. This is just your initial clip that you selected with no effects. Then we have roto with blur. So this is what we just made, where you've exported your roto brushed player with the pixel motion blur effect and the parameters that you've set. After that, we have this motion trail. This is what we're going to get into making right now, and this is really what we're aiming for to tie this effect together. Next, we have our subject with no motion blur. You can see that he's not at full opacity, but we needed this to blend everything together. And finally, we have this layer called roto in front of trail. So this is players or objects that pass in front of our subject and relative to the camera should be closer to the camera than the motion trail and therefore needed to be masked in front of it. Hopefully you don't have anything in front of your subject, but if you do, you have to cut it out eventually during this process. But let's get rid of that for a moment and just focus on this layer right here, how to create this motion trail. So first we're going to hop into this pre-composition. So you can see down here, I have our rotoscoped player with the particle playground effect that we've exported. And now we're going to create a white solid. So Command Y and click white if this isn't already on white. Okay. And then click OK. And that's going to give you this white solid. We're going to rename this to motion trail. I'll delete this now because you can see I've already done this. And the effect that we want to add is called particle playground. So under particle playground, you want to come to layer map, and now we're going to select our roto with blur as the layer map. So you can see we have none selected. I'll put this back as it was. And let's select roto with blur. And this is going to mean that the particles generated by the particle playground effect are mapping to be whatever is on this layer, which is our subject cut out with the blur effect. And now we want to make sure that effects and masks is selected and change this time offset type to absolute. Now, if I drop our main shot in here and line it up so that the first frame where we started rotoscoping is at the start of our composition, then you can see this motion trail is set so that it actually follows the player all the way through the shot. And you're going to mess around with this time offset parameter until you get it so that when you have your first frame where you've roto brushed all lined up, it looks like the trail is kind of following the player. Now, there's no natural gravity with the particle playground effect that's going to make this trail look like it's actually in some way associated with your player. So you want to come into this canon section of the effect here and mess around with the speed and the direction and the gravity force in the particle playground effect to make this look realistic. So you can see here, if I mess around with the gravity force, we can make this look all types of funky. So I just turn the gravity force up and it looks like it's floating really, really high, which is obviously wrong. And if you turn it way down, you'll get a result in the opposite direction where it looks like it's floating really, really low and just sinking for some weird reason. So you want to find the level of gravity force, I guess, that makes sense with how your subject is moving. If they're moving up, then you want the trail to be below them. If they're moving down, then you want the trail to be above them. If they're moving to the right, then you want the trail to be on the same plane as them, but to the left. And then mess around with the direction in the same way. You can see here that I've actually keyframed the direction a little bit so that the angle changes as our player turns from going to the right to going a little bit downhill, because in theory this should dip a little bit as he starts running away from the camera. And then I've just changed the opacity on our motion trail to fade out as our player starts going for the layup over here, because I kind of want it to end at this point right there so we can just focus on the ball going in. And then looking at your main shot, you want to add, you can add the glow and the hue saturation effects if you want. I didn't love how this glow looked on mine, but you can mess around with it if you'd like. But you want to add the curves and the directional blur effect to really sell this as a trail. So I used the curves here to make my trail look from this, which is like essentially the color of the player, to look very blue. and more so match the color of the player's jersey and be on brand for this team. And then I use the directional blur to further sell this trail, because you can see here, like, it's a motion trail, but it looks like it's a bunch of players, and I don't like how you can see this player right at the end. So I added the directional blur to just kind of smooth everything out. Once you have that all made, then select your motion trail and your roto brush with blur, which is, remember, the layer that is being referenced in the particle playground effect right here under layer map. Select them both, click Command, Shift, and C, and move all attributes into new composition. Click OK. Now, ignoring the disabled layers here, once you pre-compose this, you want to have something like this where you have your main shot with no effects, and then you have the motion trail that we just created right behind. You can see here that I've added a brightness and contrast effect and just brought a little bit of brightness into the trail to make it stand out a little bit. And if you click U, you can see that I actually animated the position and rotation of this trail to get lower as the player jumps. So it rotates and moves below him. I'm pretty sure plugins will allow you to do this manually and account for gravity better, but this is what I meant at the start of the video when I said I'm pretty sure they use plugins for this. I'm just manually adjusting for gravity, but I don't think that you always have to do that if you're using tools outside of After Effects, or heck, maybe there's a way in After Effects to do it and I just don't know it. But this is how we went about it. And then I wanted this trail to actually fade off as we progressed. So you can see that I drew a mask where I'm essentially following the player through the entire time, and then the mask gets skinnier to make the trail less long. I added a very large feather to this mask, but if I get rid of the mask here, you can see that this trail does not fade. And if I were to just completely trash this mask, then it would just never fade. The trail would get longer and longer and not really follow the player, which doesn't look very good. So I drew this mask that essentially, with a large feather, makes the trail slowly fade off and follows him so that it remains a fairly consistent length until it just disappears. Now I'm going to call this bit optional, but I like the way it looked. I grabbed our cutout player with the pixel motion blur effect and actually dropped it in between our main shot and our motion trail. So instead of having something that looks like this, where the player is just regular with a trail behind him, the player now has a blur to him as well. And I think this made the effect look a little bit better. And then I took our roto brush layer that we've already cut out. If I bring this opacity back to 100%, I took our cutout player without the pixel motion blur effect, turned the opacity down to about 65%, and then I put that over top of everything else, essentially. That way, instead of our player being completely behind the motion trail like this, we actually have a decent cutout of him above the motion trail. You can mess with this how you want. You could do maybe 20% opacity of your player over top of the trail, and that's going to look like this and really make the trail go into the player. Maybe you think it looks better with 100% opacity. I would disagree with that. But find an opacity that works for you and put the cutout of your player back over top of this so that you can make him out and it can be a little bit more discernible. Then the final thing you have to do is, as you go through this, look for any areas where a player passes in front of your camera. So here, these two players are going to walk in front, and here in theory, the motion blur trail is still right here, and these two players are technically in front of it. So I had to cut them out. So again, grab the roto brush tool. If you come into this layer here, you can see that I've just gone through and cut them out the exact same way we did for our main player at the very start of this tutorial. So go ahead and do that. When you've cut your players out, click freeze. And then when you come back to your composition, you'll be able to see that if you turn this off, the players are not in front of the motion trail as they should be. And when you turn it on, the players are now in front of the motion trail as they should be. And that gives you this cool motion trail follow effect, very similar to the one in that NBA video. I hope you found this helpful and are gonna go use this effect in some cool content. If you do use it in anything you make, please tag me at Sarellas and let me see it. If you have any questions about this, or if you have ideas into how to make the effect look more realistic and more like what they did in the commercial. Let me know in the comments section. I would love to workshop this together. And if you like this video, subscribe, because I post sports videography and video editing tips and tutorial videos similar to this on a regular basis. And I'd love to have you around for that. But that's gonna be all for today. So until next time, peace.